The morning sun was just breaking through the tall oak trees when David stepped out of the old bus at Riverside University. He carried everything he owned in two worn duffel bags, one over each shoulder. The campus looked like something from a movie with its red brick buildings and perfectly trimmed lawns. Students were already walking around with their expensive backpacks and designer clothes, talking and laughing as if they owned the place. David took a deep breath and started walking toward the admissions building. He had worked 3 jobs all through high school to save money for this moment. His mom had cried when he got the partial scholarship letter. She knew how hard he had studied, how many nights he stayed up doing math problems while his friends were out having fun. The mathematics department building was older than the others, with ivy growing up the walls and heavy wooden doors that creaked when you opened them. David found his way to the main office where a friendly secretary handed him his class schedule and room assignments. Professor Wilson and Professor Hayes would be his main instructors for advanced calculus and mathematical theory. "You must be our scholarship student," said a voice behind him. David turned around to see a tall, thin man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Professor Wilson. I teach the morning calculus section." David shook his hand politely. "Yes, sir. I'm looking forward to your class." Professor Wilson looked him up and down, taking in his simple clothes and worn sneakers. "Well, we'll see how that goes. The coursework here is quite demanding. Not everyone who gets in actually belongs here, if you know what I mean." David felt. His stomach tightened, but he just nodded. He had heard comments like this before, though never from a teacher. "I understand, sir. I'm ready to work hard." "Good, good," Professor Wilson said, though his tone suggested he didn't really believe it. "Just remember, this isn't high school anymore. The standards here are very different." After Professor Wilson walked away, David found his dorm room on the 3rd floor of the oldest building on campus. His roommate hadn't arrived yet, so he unpacked his few belongings in silence. He had brought his collection of math books, some borrowed from the library back home, others bought used from online stores. These books were his treasures, filled with notes and bookmarks from countless hours of study. That evening, David walked across campus to find the coffee shop where he would be working nights. The manager, Mrs. Peterson, was a kind woman in her 50s who seemed genuinely happy to have him. "The hours are perfect for a student," she explained as she showed him around. "You'll work from 8 at night until 2 in the morning, Monday through Friday. It's mostly cleaning up, restocking, and helping the few night owl students who come in to study." David was grateful for the job. The money would help cover his textbooks and the small expenses his scholarship didn't include. Plus, he actually enjoyed the quiet atmosphere of late-night work. It reminded him of all those nights back home when he would study math problems at the kitchen table while his mom worked her second shift at the hospital. His first day of classes was both exciting and intimidating. The lecture halls were bigger than his entire high school, and the other students seemed so confident and comfortable. David took a seat in the middle of the room for Professor Wilson's calculus class, pulling out a simple notebook and pen while others around him had expensive laptops and tablets. Professor Wilson started the class by writing a complex equation on the board. "Let's see who did their summer preparation work," he said with a slight smile. "Can anyone tell me how to approach this problem?" Several hands shot up immediately. David knew the answer too, but something held him back. He had learned over the years that sometimes it was better to stay quiet and observe first. Professor Wilson called on a student in the front row who gave a confident but incorrect answer. Then he called on another student who got closer, but still missed the key insight. David watched as the professor's expression grew slightly impatient. "Anyone else?" Professor Wilson asked, his eyes scanning the room. They paused on David for a moment, and David could see the challenge in his look. David slowly raised his hand. "The key is to recognize the substitution pattern first," he said quietly. "If you set u equal to the inner function, the integration becomes much clearer." Professor Wilson's eyebrows went up slightly. "Correct," he said, sounding almost surprised. "That's exactly right." David felt a small surge of satisfaction, but he also noticed some of the other students turning to look at him with curiosity. He decided it might be better to keep a lower profile in future classes. After class, David went to the library to study. The mathematics section was enormous, with shelves that stretched up to the high ceiling. He found a quiet corner table and spread out his homework. The problems were challenging, but not impossible. In fact, he found himself finishing them faster than he had expected. While he worked, David couldn't help but overhear two students talking at a nearby table. One of them was complaining about Professor Hayes, his other main instructor. "He's so old school," the student was saying. "He thinks everyone should struggle just because he did when he was young. And don't even get me started on how he talks about the scholarship students." David's pen stopped moving across his paper. He strained to hear more. "What do you mean?" the other student asked. "Oh, you know, all that stuff about maintaining standards and making sure people really deserve to be here. He and Professor Wilson are always going on about it in faculty meetings. My dad knows some of the board members." David felt his chest tighten. He gathered his books quickly and moved to another part of the library. He tried to focus on his homework, but the conversation kept replaying in his mind. He had worked so hard to get here. His test scores were higher than most of the other students. Why should he have to prove himself any more than anyone else? That night at the coffee shop, David found comfort in the routine work. The repetitive tasks of cleaning and restocking gave his mind time to settle. Around midnight, a few students came in to study, and David made them coffee while they worked on their assignments. One of them was struggling with a calculus problem that David recognized from his homework. "That's a tricky one," David said as he delivered the student's coffee. "Have you tried working backwards from the answer?" The student looked up, surprised. "You know calculus?" "A little," David said modestly. "Sometimes it helps to think about where you want to end up before you figure out how to get there." The student tried David's suggestion and broke into a smile when it worked. "That's brilliant. Are you a math major too?" "Yeah," David said. "Just started this semester. Maybe we could study together sometime. I'm always looking for help with the harder problems." David agreed, feeling good about making a potential friend. But as he walked back to his dorm at 2:30, in the morning he thought about the conversation he had overheard in the library. He wondered if Professor Hayes would be as skeptical as Professor Wilson seemed to be. He decided that no matter what happened, he would just focus on doing his best work. He had come too far to let anyone's doubt stop him now. As he fell asleep, in his narrow dorm bed, David was already looking forward to tomorrow's classes and the challenges they would bring. What he didn't know was that Professors Wilson and Hayes had already been talking about him, and their conversation was not the kind that would have made him sleep peacefully if he had heard it. 3 weeks into the semester, David had settled into a routine that would have exhausted most students. He attended morning classes, spent afternoons in the library, worked at the coffee shop until 2 in the morning, then studied for another hour before finally getting some sleep. His grades were perfect so far, but he kept that information to himself. Professor Wilson had been watching David more closely after that first day when he solved the integration problem. During lectures, David noticed the professor's eyes would often drift toward him, especially when presenting difficult concepts. There was something calculating in that gaze that made David uncomfortable. It was a Thursday afternoon when David overheard the conversation that changed everything. He was in the library's upper level, tucked away in a corner with advanced calculus textbooks spread around him. The mathematics section was usually quiet, which is why he was surprised to hear voices coming from the faculty study room nearby. "The presentation day is perfect timing," Professor Wilson was saying. "All the department heads will be there, plus the dean. It's the ideal opportunity." "Are you sure about this approach?" came another voice that David recognized as Professor Hayes. "It seems rather deliberate." "Look, Richard," Professor Wilson continued, "we both know the pressure the university is under to show diversity in our program. But we can't let standards slip just to make the administration happy. This student might have decent test scores, but there's a difference between memorizing formulas and truly understanding advanced mathematics." David's stomach dropped. He knew they were talking about him. There were only 3 scholarship students in the advanced program, and the other 2 came from wealthy families who had simply qualified for merit aid. "The problem I'm designing will require genuine mathematical insight," Professor Wilson went on. "It's not something you can fake or guess your way through. If he really belongs here, he'll find a way to solve it. If not, well, it'll be obvious to everyone in that room. Professor Hayes sighed. And you're certain this is necessary? His homework assignments have been excellent. Homework can be collaborative. Tests can be studied for. But this presentation will be him, alone, in front of the entire faculty. No hiding, no help, no excuses. David heard papers rustling. This problem combines topology, number theory, and advanced calculus. Professor Wilson continued with obvious pride. I pulled it from a graduate-level competition. Even our best doctoral students would struggle with this. And you're planning to give this to a first-semester undergraduate? Professor Hayes sounded uncertain. He'll be the last presenter of the day. Maximum impact. I've already spoken to Dr. Martinez about making sure all the department chairs attend. We'll frame it as a special challenge for our most promising student. David felt sick. They weren't testing his ability. They were setting him up to fail in the most public way possible. The presentation day was in 2 weeks, where students had to solve complex problems in front of faculty and peers. It was supposed to be a celebration of student achievement, not a trap. What if he actually solves it? Professor Hayes asked. Professor Wilson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Trust me, Richard, that's not going to happen. David sat frozen in his chair until he heard their footsteps retreating down the hallway. His hands were shaking as he closed his textbooks. He had known about the subtle hostility, the sideways glances, the comments about maintaining standards. But this was different. This was a deliberate attempt to humiliate him in front of the entire mathematics department. That night at the coffee shop, David couldn't concentrate on his work. He kept replaying the conversation in his mind. Part of him wanted to march into Professor Wilson's office and confront him directly. Another part wanted to just drop out and go home. The unfairness of it burned in his chest. Around 11 o'clock, a graduate student named Alex came in for his usual late-night coffee. David had gotten to know him over the past few weeks. Alex was working on his doctorate in theoretical mathematics, and often stayed up all night working on his research. You look like someone stole your favorite equation, Alex said with a friendly smile. Rough day? David managed a weak laugh. Something like that. Can I ask you about the department presentation day? Oh, that's always interesting, Alex said, settling into his usual corner table. The professors give students challenging problems to solve in front of everyone. It's supposed to show off the talent in the program. Why? How hard are the problems usually? Alex thought for a moment. Challenging, but fair. Usually stuff that a good undergraduate should be able to handle with some thought. Professor Martinez, always make sure they're appropriate for each student's level. Why do you ask? David hesitated. He couldn't exactly explain what he had overheard without sounding paranoid. Just nervous, I guess. I'm supposed to present. You'll do fine, Alex said encouragingly. I've seen your work when you help other students here. You clearly know your stuff. After Alex left, David spent the rest of his shift thinking. He realized that Professor Wilson was counting on him being unprepared for whatever impossible problem they were planning. But what if he wasn't unprepared? What if he used the next 2 weeks to push himself harder than he had ever pushed before? The next morning, David went to the library before his first class. He found the graduate mathematics section and started pulling books that most undergraduates never touched. Advanced topology, modular forms, complex analysis, subjects that weren't even offered at the undergraduate level. Over the next few days, David established a new routine. He attended his regular classes but spent every free moment diving into graduate-level mathematics. He checked out books on number theory and spent hours working through proofs that made his regular homework look elementary. The night shift at the coffee shop became his intensive study time. When there were no customers, David would spread advanced textbooks across the counter and work through problems that would challenge doctoral students. He started seeing connections between different areas of mathematics that he had never noticed before. Alex noticed the change during one of his late-night visits. Getting into some heavy reading, he observed, glancing at the open book on Riemann surfaces. That's graduate-level stuff. Just curious, David said casually. I like seeing how everything connects. That's the spirit that makes great mathematicians, Alex said approvingly. Most students just want to pass their classes. You're actually trying to understand the bigger picture. What Alex didn't realize was that David was preparing for battle. Every theorem he mastered, every proof technique he learned, was another weapon in his arsenal for whatever Professor Wilson was planning to throw at him. By the end of the first week, David was working through problems that even some graduate students would find challenging. His regular coursework seemed almost trivial now, which created an interesting problem. He had to be careful not to show too much knowledge in his regular classes. Professor Wilson was already suspicious of his abilities. During Professor Wilson's lectures, David would sit quietly and take notes, but his mind was often working on much more complex problems. When the professor would present what he thought were challenging concepts, David found himself thinking about applications and extensions that went far beyond the scope of the class. The second week of preparation was even more intense. David discovered that the university library had access to mathematical journals and research papers that contained cutting-edge work in theoretical mathematics. He started reading papers by famous mathematicians trying to understand not just their results, but their methods of thinking. One night, while working through a particularly complex proof about elliptic curves, David had a breakthrough. He suddenly understood how several different areas of mathematics were connected in ways that weren't obvious on the surface. It was like seeing a hidden pattern that tied everything together. He looked up from his books and realized it was almost 3 in the morning. The coffee shop was empty except for him, and he had been so absorbed in his work that he hadn't even noticed the time passing. As he cleaned up and prepared to close the shop, David felt something he hadn't experienced before. Confidence that went beyond just knowing he was right about a particular problem. He was starting to understand mathematics at a deeper level, seeing the elegant structure that connected seemingly different areas of study. Tomorrow would mark 1 week until the presentation day. David knew that Professor Wilson was probably finalizing his trap, confident that no first-semester undergraduate could handle whatever graduate-level problem he was preparing. What Professor Wilson couldn't know was that David was no longer just a first-semester undergraduate. He was becoming something else entirely, a mathematician who was ready for whatever challenge came his way. The morning of presentation day arrived with gray clouds hanging low over the campus. David woke up at 6, 2 hours earlier than usual, but he hadn't been sleeping well anyway. His mind kept running through different types of problems Professor Wilson might throw at him. After 2 weeks of intensive preparation, he felt as ready as he could be, but there was still a knot of nervousness in his stomach. He skipped breakfast and went straight to the library to review his notes one last time. The mathematics section was empty at this early hour, which gave him the quiet he needed. David spread out his handwritten summaries of advanced topology, number theory, and complex analysis. His notebooks were filled with theorems, proofs, and solution techniques that most graduate students would struggle with. At 9 o'clock, students started arriving for their regular classes, but David stayed in the library. He couldn't concentrate on normal coursework today, not with what was waiting for him in the afternoon. Instead, he worked through practice problems, keeping his mind sharp and focused. Around 11, Alex appeared at his table with 2 cups of coffee from the campus cafe. "Thought you might need this," he said, setting 1 cup down next to David's books. "Big day today, right?" David accepted the coffee gratefully. "Yeah, the presentations are this afternoon." Alex glanced at the advanced textbooks scattered around the table. "You've been hitting the graduate level stuff pretty hard lately. That's impressive dedication for an undergraduate." "Just trying to stay ahead," David said, closing one of the topology books. He had been careful not to let anyone know exactly how much he had been studying, but Alex was observant. "Well, whatever they throw at you today, I'm sure you'll handle it," Alex said encouragingly. "I've seen how you think through problems. You've got real mathematical intuition." After Alex left, David packed up his books and walked across campus. He had 3 hours before the presentations began, but he wanted to see the room where it would all happen. The department's main lecture hall was in the oldest building, with high ceilings and wooden panels that had probably witnessed decades of mathematical discoveries. The room was empty except for a janitor setting up chairs. David walked down to the front where a large whiteboard stretched across the entire wall. This was where he would either prove himself or face public humiliation. He imagined the room filled with faculty members, all watching as Professor Wilson presented his impossible problem. "You're here early," came a voice from behind him. David turned to see Dr. Martinez, the department head, walking down the aisle with a stack of papers. "Just wanted to see the room," David said politely. Dr. Martinez smiled. "Nervous? That's normal. I remember my first presentation when I was a student. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the chalk." "How do you deal with the nerves?" "Remember that everyone in that room wants you to succeed," Dr. Martinez said kindly. "We're not here to trip you up or make you fail. We're here because we're excited to see what young mathematicians can do." David nodded, though he knew that at least two people in the audience would not be hoping for his success. Dr. Martinez seemed genuine in her encouragement, which made him feel slightly better. At noon, David forced himself to eat lunch in the student cafeteria. The food tasted like cardboard, but he knew he needed fuel for what was coming. Other students were talking and laughing around him, completely unaware of the drama that was about to unfold in the mathematics department. By 1 o'clock, David was back in the lecture hall. Students and faculty members were starting to arrive, taking their seats in the tiered rows. David recognized most of his classmates, but there were also faces he didn't know, presumably the department chairs and other faculty that Professor Wilson had specifically invited. Professor Wilson entered the room at exactly 1:15, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing what looked like his best suit. He made eye contact with David for just a moment, and David saw something that looked almost like satisfaction in his expression. Professor Hayes followed a few steps behind, looking uncomfortable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Martinez announced, as she took the podium, "welcome to our annual student presentation day. Today we'll see some of the finest mathematical thinking from our undergraduate program." The presentations began with simpler problems for the younger students. David watched his classmates work through calculus problems and geometry proofs, all of which were challenging but appropriate for their level of study. The audience was supportive, applauding each successful solution. As the afternoon progressed, the problems became more difficult. David noticed that Professor Wilson kept checking his watch and looking toward the back of the room, as if waiting for someone. Around 3 o'clock, several more faculty members entered, including some David recognized as department heads from other universities who must have been visiting campus. "Perfect timing," Professor Wilson murmured to Professor Hayes, loud enough for David to hear from his seat in the front row. Finally, Dr. Martinez returned to the podium. "For our final presentation of the day, we have a special challenge problem, prepared by Professor Wilson. This will be presented by David, one of our most promising first-year students." David felt every eye in the room turn toward him as he stood up. His legs felt steady, which surprised him. All the preparation had given him a quiet confidence that he hadn't expected to feel. Professor Wilson walked to the whiteboard with obvious ceremony. "This problem," he announced to the room, "combines several advanced areas of mathematics. It will test not just computational ability, but genuine mathematical insight and creativity." He began writing on the board, and David felt his breath catch. The problem was even more complex than he had imagined. It started with a function involving elliptic curves, then moved into modular forms, and finally required a proof using advanced techniques from algebraic topology. Each line that Professor Wilson wrote made the problem more intimidating. The room grew quiet as the full scope of the challenge became clear. David heard someone in the audience whisper, "That's graduate-level work." Another voice murmured, "Is this appropriate for an undergraduate?" Professor Wilson finished writing and turned to face the room with a slight smile. "The problem asks for a complete proof of this theorem, including all intermediate steps and justifications. You may use any approach you find suitable." David looked at the board, taking in the full complexity of what he was facing. It was exactly the type of problem he had been preparing for. a combination of different mathematical areas that required deep understanding rather than just memorization. He walked to the board slowly, aware that the room was completely silent. Professor Wilson stepped aside with what David could swear was a satisfied expression, as if he was already anticipating the failure he expected to witness. David picked up the marker and stood in front of the board for a long moment, studying the problem. He could feel the tension in the room, the mix of curiosity and concern from the audience. Some faculty members were already shifting uncomfortably in their seats, probably recognizing that this was far beyond what any undergraduate should be expected to handle. But as David looked at the problem, something interesting happened. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, he began to see the elegant structure underneath the complexity. The different parts of the problem weren't separate challenges. They were all connected, part of a larger mathematical truth that Professor Wilson might not have fully appreciated when he designed the trap. David began to see not just one solution, but multiple possible approaches. The 2 weeks of intensive study had given him more than just knowledge. They had given him a deeper understanding of how mathematics worked at its highest levels. He turned to face the room briefly. Professor Wilson was leaning back in his chair, with his arms crossed, clearly expecting to enjoy the next few minutes. Professor Hayes looked genuinely worried. Dr. Martinez was sitting forward with interest, probably wondering if the problem was too difficult. David turned back to the board and began to write his first line. The marker felt steady in his hand, and his mind was clear and focused. Whatever happened next, he was ready for it. The silence in the room was so complete that the only sound was the soft scratching of the marker against the whiteboard as David began his response to Professor Wilson's carefully crafted trap. David's first line on the whiteboard was simple, almost deceptively so. He wrote a basic equation that looked nothing like the complex problem Professor Wilson had presented. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, probably thinking he was already lost and grasping for something familiar. Professor Wilson's eyebrows went up slightly, and David caught the hint of a smirk on his face. This was exactly what he had expected, a struggling student starting with elementary mathematics because he couldn't handle the real challenge. But David knew exactly what he was doing. The simple equation was like the first domino in a carefully planned sequence. He had learned during his weeks of intensive study that the most elegant mathematical solutions often began with something basic that others might overlook. As David continued writing, his approach became clearer. He wasn't attacking the problem head-on like a brute force approach. Instead, he was finding the hidden structure that connected all the different parts. His second line introduced a substitution that most people wouldn't think to try. His third line revealed a pattern that wasn't obvious from the original problem. The room remained silent, but the quality of that silence was changing. Instead of awkward waiting, it was becoming focused attention. Faculty members were leaning forward in their seats, trying to follow David's reasoning. Dr. Martinez, who had been worried about the difficulty of the problem, found herself genuinely curious about where David was heading. His approach was unconventional but mathematically sound. More importantly, it showed the kind of creative thinking that separated good students from exceptional ones. Professor Hayes, despite his earlier participation in the scheme, was starting to feel uncomfortable for a different reason. He was beginning to realize that David wasn't struggling with the problem. He was solving it with a sophistication that even some graduate students wouldn't demonstrate. David reached the end of the first whiteboard and moved to the second one. His handwriting was clear and confident, each step following logically from the previous one. What had started as a seemingly impossible combination of different mathematical areas was becoming a unified solution under his guidance. About halfway through his solution, David did something that made several faculty members sit up straight. He identified a more efficient pathway through the problem than what Professor Wilson had probably intended. Instead of laboriously working through each part separately, David showed how they could be combined using a technique from algebraic topology that created a shortcut. Professor Wilson's confident expression was beginning to fade. He had spent considerable time crafting this problem, pulling together elements that he thought would be impossible for any undergraduate to handle. But David wasn't just handling it, he was making it look elegant. The visiting faculty members from other universities were now paying very close attention. One of them, Dr. Thompson from State University, whispered to his colleague, "This is graduate-level thinking. How is an undergraduate doing this?" David continued working, completely absorbed in the mathematics. The nervousness he had felt that morning was gone, replaced by the pure joy of solving a beautiful problem. This was what he loved about mathematics, the moment when complexity gave way to clarity, when chaos revealed its underlying order. As he approached the final section of the proof, David paused for a moment. He had reached the point where most people would finish the problem using the standard approach, but during his preparation, he had discovered something interesting. There was a way to not only solve the problem, but to extend it, to show something even more profound than what the original question had asked. David made a decision that would change everything. Instead of just completing the proof as requested, he added an additional section. He began writing a generalization that showed how the theorem could be extended to a broader class of functions. This wasn't just solving the problem, this was advancing the mathematical understanding beyond what was originally asked. The room was now completely absorbed in what David was doing. Even students who didn't fully understand the advanced mathematics could sense that something extraordinary was happening. David was writing with the confidence of someone who didn't just know the answer, but understood the deeper principles at work. Professor Wilson was no longer smirking. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at the whiteboard with growing disbelief. The problem that was supposed to expose David's limitations was instead revealing capabilities that Wilson hadn't imagined possible. Dr. Martinez was taking notes, recognizing that she was witnessing something special. David's solution was not only correct but innovative. He was using techniques that she had seen in advanced mathematical journals, applying them with a creativity that suggested genuine mathematical talent. As David wrote his final lines, he did something that left the entire room stunned. He turned the original problem around and used his solution to prove a related theorem that hadn't even been part of the original question. It was like solving a puzzle and then using the solution to create an even more beautiful puzzle. When David finally put down the marker and stepped back from the whiteboard, the silence in the room was profound. 2 full whiteboards were covered with mathematics that told a complete story. From the original complex problem to an elegant solution to an unexpected extension that pushed the boundaries further. David turned to face the audience, suddenly remembering where he was. For the past 45 minutes he had been lost in the pure world of mathematics. Now he was back in the lecture hall, facing a room full of people who were staring at him with expressions ranging from amazement to shock. Dr. Martinez was the first to speak. She stood up slowly, her eyes moving between David and the whiteboard. "This is..." She paused, searching for words. "This is extraordinary work." Dr. Thompson, the visiting professor, was furiously taking notes. "Excuse me," he called out, "but could you explain how you thought to use the algebraic topology approach in the 3rd section? That's not a standard technique for this type of problem." David nodded, still feeling the calm confidence that had carried him through the solution. "I noticed that the modular form section had a structure that was similar to problems I'd seen in topology. When you look at the underlying symmetries, they're really the same mathematical object in different clothing." Several faculty members exchanged glances. This wasn't the language of a struggling undergraduate. This was the kind of insight that came from deep mathematical understanding. Professor Hayes looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. The scheme that had seemed so reasonable when Professor Wilson first proposed it now felt cruel and unnecessary. Worse, it had backfired completely, revealing not David's weaknesses but his remarkable strengths. Alex, who had arrived late and was standing in the back of the room, broke into a huge grin. He had seen hints of David's abilities during their late-night conversations at the coffee shop, but this was beyond what he had imagined. His friend wasn't just a good student, he was a mathematical prodigy. Professor Wilson sat frozen in his chair, staring at the whiteboard as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The trap he had set with such confidence had become a stage for David to demonstrate abilities that exceeded even his own understanding. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, the room erupted in applause. Students, faculty, and visitors all rose to their feet, recognizing that they had witnessed something truly special. David had not only solved an impossible problem, he had done it with a grace and creativity that marked him as a mathematician of exceptional promise. But David barely heard the applause. He was still looking at the whiteboard, already thinking about the next mathematical questions that his solution had revealed. For him, this wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning of a much larger adventure. The applause gradually died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. David stood at the front, still processing what had just happened. He had been so focused on the mathematics that he hadn't fully realized the impact of his performance until he saw the faces staring back at him. Dr. Martinez approached the whiteboard, studying David's work more closely. "This extension you've added," she said, pointing to the final section, "this could have real applications in cryptography research. Where did you learn this technique?" David felt a flush of pride mixed with nervousness. "I've been reading some graduate-level papers in my spare time. I noticed the connection a few weeks ago when I was studying elliptic curves." Dr. Thompson, the visiting professor, pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the whiteboard. "Do you mind if I share this with my colleagues? This approach could interest some researchers I know at the National Science Foundation." Before David could answer, Professor Wilson stood up abruptly. His face was red, and his hands were shaking slightly. "This is highly irregular," he said loudly. "We need to verify that this work is original. How do we know he didn't memorize this from somewhere?" The room fell silent again, but this time the atmosphere was tense rather than amazed. Dr. Martinez turned to look at Professor Wilson with obvious surprise. "Excuse me, Professor Wilson, but are you questioning the integrity of a student's work without any evidence?" "I'm simply saying that this level of mathematics is beyond what any undergraduate should be capable of," Professor Wilson replied, his voice getting louder. "Perhaps we should investigate how he prepared for this presentation." David felt the familiar knot in his stomach, but this time it was accompanied by something else. Anger. After everything he had just accomplished, Professor Wilson was still trying to tear him down. Alex stepped forward from the back of the room. "Actually, I can speak to David's preparation. I've seen him studying graduate-level texts in the coffee shop where he works nights. He's been doing this for weeks, completely, on his own." Several other students nodded in agreement. One of them, a sophomore named Lisa, raised her hand. "David helped me with my calculus homework last month. He explained concepts that our professor hadn't even covered yet. He definitely knows this stuff." Professor Hayes, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. His voice was quiet but clear. "Robert," he said to Professor Wilson, "I think we need to discuss this privately." But Dr. Martinez wasn't having it. "No, I think we need to discuss this right here. Professor Wilson, did you specifically design this problem to be beyond undergraduate level?" Professor Wilson's face grew even redder. "I designed it to challenge our students and maintain our academic standards." "Academic standards?" Dr. Thompson interjected. "This young man just demonstrated understanding that would impress doctoral candidates at my university. If anything, this raises our standards." The tension in the room was becoming uncomfortable. David realized that his moment of triumph was turning into a confrontation that was bigger than just him. This was about fairness, about giving people chances, about not judging someone before they had the opportunity to prove themselves. Dr. Martinez made a decision. "Professor Wilson, Professor Hayes, I'd like to see you in my office immediately after this session ends. David, would you be willing to meet with me tomorrow to discuss your academic future here?" David nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Over the next hour, as students and faculty filed out of the lecture hall, something remarkable happened. Person after person stopped to congratulate David and ask questions about his solution. Dr. Thompson handed him a business card and invited him to apply for a summer research program. Two other professors mentioned graduate programs at their universities. But the conversation that meant the most came from Dr. Martinez herself. She approached David as he was packing up his notebooks. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I had no idea what Professor Wilson was planning. This was supposed to be a celebration of student achievement, not a setup for failure." David looked up at her. "You don't need to apologize. You weren't part of it. Maybe not directly, but I should have been paying closer attention to what was happening in my own department. Your success today has opened my eyes to some problems we need to address." The next morning, David was walking across campus when he got a text message asking him to come to Dr. Martinez's office. When he arrived, he found her with a stack of papers and a serious expression. "I've spent the morning making some phone calls," she said. "First, I want you to know that Professor Wilson has been removed from all student evaluation committees. He'll also be required to complete bias training before he can teach again." David felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. He hadn't wanted to destroy anyone's career, but he was glad that other students wouldn't face what he had experienced. "Second," Dr. Martinez continued, "I've been in touch with the graduate admissions office. Based on your performance yesterday, they're willing to let you take graduate-level courses while you finish your undergraduate degree. This is very unusual, but your situation is exceptional." David's eyes widened. "Really?" "There's more. The National Mathematics Foundation has a special scholarship program for students who show exceptional promise. Dr. Thompson recommended you, and they want to offer you full funding for both your remaining undergraduate years and graduate school." David sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. Just 2 days ago, he had been a struggling scholarship student working nights to pay for textbooks. Now doors were opening that he had never even imagined existed. "What about Professor Wilson?" David asked. Dr. Martinez's expression grew serious. "Professor Wilson will face a formal review of his conduct. What he did was not just unprofessional, it was discriminatory. The university takes this very seriously." Weeks later, David received an email that made him smile. It was from a mathematical journal, asking if he would be interested in publishing his solution to Professor Wilson's problem. His innovative approach had caught the attention of researchers around the world. But the moment that meant the most came that evening at the coffee shop. Alex burst through the door with a huge grin and a newspaper in his hand. "You made the university newspaper," Alex announced, spreading it out on the counter. The headline read, "Undergraduate Student Solves Graduate-Level Problem. Inspires Departmental Changes." David laughed as he read the article. It told the whole story, the setup, the solution, and the aftermath. But what struck him most was the final paragraph, which quoted Dr. Martinez. "This incident has reminded us that talent comes in many forms and from many backgrounds. Our job as educators is to nurture that talent, not test it with traps." Over. The following months, David's life changed in ways he could never have predicted. He started working as a research assistant, helping professors with problems that challenged him in new ways. He began tutoring other students, particularly those from backgrounds similar to his own, showing them that they belonged in advanced mathematics too. Professor Wilson quietly took early retirement at the end of the semester. David heard that he had moved to a small private school where he would be teaching basic algebra. Professor Hayes, meanwhile, had become one of David's strongest supporters, often mentioning how much the incident had taught him about his own assumptions. But perhaps the most important change was in David himself. The confidence he had felt while solving that impossible problem had become a permanent part of who he was. He no longer doubted whether he belonged in advanced mathematics. He knew he did, and he was determined to help others discover that they belonged there too. Years later, when David had become Dr. David and was teaching at a major university, he would often tell his students about that day in the lecture hall, not to brag about his own abilities, but to remind them that brilliance can come from anywhere, and that the most beautiful mathematical truths often emerge when people are given the chance to show what they're truly capable of. The story had become more than just one student's triumph over prejudice. It had become a reminder that when we judge people by their potential, rather than our preconceptions, everyone wins, especially mathematics itself.